So my apologetic method is as follows. I begin making a case for Christianity from ground zero, almost imagining like I'm talking to somebody who has no idea what Christianity is. Now this approach doesn't need to be taken with somebody, let's say, for example, who already believes that there's a God, right? So if I'm talking to a Muslim, they already believe that there is a supreme being, and so I don't have to go through reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God. I can jump right to the second step in my apologetic method. But if I'm talking to a broad audience like this, or if I'm making a case for Christianity from ground zero, there's going to be various people at different levels, right, of belief and understanding of things. And so my apologetic method, if I'm starting from ground zero, talking to a large audience, where some of them would be atheists, I think the appropriate place to begin is with the existence of God. So we're going to be doing that for several weeks. Then we'll move to step 2 and ultimately step 3, of course. When it comes to arguments for the existence of God, there are many. And when I say many, I mean dozens at least. But there's 3 main families of arguments, okay? And within each family, there are several different types. Last week we talked about first cause arguments, which have been around almost forever. We can find first cause arguments throughout history, all around the world, as independent thinkers developed first cause type arguments, which led them to the conclusion that there is some sort of supreme being out there. So first cause arguments have been around for a long time. This morning we're going to focus in on design arguments for the existence of God, okay? And then next week you'll see where we're going. It'll be moral arguments. Now there are many, many design arguments, and this morning we're briefly going to look at 3 of them, okay? 3 different design arguments. But they all begin with the same premise, the same first premise. And that is this idea that every design has a designer. Now that's an empirical observation. We've just never seen design come from anything but an intelligent mind. That's what I mean by designer, by the way, an intelligent mind. Could design come from some other source? It's possible, I suppose. We've just never seen it. We've just never seen design come from anything else but an intelligent mind. And so the first premise, I think, is pretty solid. The second premise in this particular design argument is that the universe has design. If the universe has design, then according to the first premise, it makes sense to conclude that the universe has a designer. The fourth step in this argument is more of an abductive reasoning premise, where we reason to the best explanation for this designer, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about how to make that move towards the end of class this morning. The second argument, again, starts out, every design has a designer. But the second thing that we'll discuss, and this one we'll just do briefly this morning, is the idea that the earth itself seems to indicate it's been designed. So we've got the universe, now we have earth. But otherwise, the argument flows the same. And then last, the third one we'll take a look at is, again, same flow of the argument, but now we're talking about biological life. It seems that life itself, including us, shows signs of being designed. So really the difference between these 3 arguments then is where we see design. Just like with first cause arguments, we see design arguments all the way throughout history, around the world. Separate, independent thinkers, philosophers, come to this conclusion that there is a supreme being through this sort of thought process. First cause arguments, design arguments. I'll give you just one example for sake of time this morning. Socrates is very well known for some of his design arguments. You might recognize Socrates, very familiar name in the history of Western civilization as a great thinker. He argued that the world seemed providentially designed by a vastly knowledgeable and powerful being. And to make his case, he pointed to the purpose found in very simple things, even like our eyelashes. He used as an example of something that seems to have been designed for a purpose, to shield or protect our eyes. And then from those sort of things concluded there must have been an ultimate designer of reality. Now we're going to look at more recent arguments. Socrates was 2,000 years plus. We're going to look at more recent arguments that have been strengthened, just like last week, by modern scientific discoveries. I lean on professional scientists for a lot of this material because I'm not one. I specialize in the area of morality, ethics, philosophy. I can understand these arguments, and I think most of us can, even if we don't have a scientific background. But for the scientific nitty-gritty, I rely on professional scientists. And this is one resource that I've benefited from greatly. I had this here last week and passed it around. Hopefully you all got a chance to write down the author, the name, if you'd like to purchase this resource yourself. But Dr. Stephen Barr has been a great resource for me. He is a professor of physics at the University of Delaware. And so I believe that provides a bit of credibility when you have somebody at such a high scientific level explaining and showing these scientific developments which strengthen the case for the existence of God. As I noted, all of these arguments begin with the same premise, and that is the idea that every design has a designer. Again, what I mean by designer is an intelligent mind, okay? And this is something that's based on empirical observations. We've just never seen design come from any other source. It's kind of like a chicken egg. I use that example often. Could a chicken egg come from something besides a chicken? Possibly. We've just never seen that, right? Is it impossible? No. But we've just never seen a chicken egg come from anything else but from a chicken. And so I think it's reasonable when you see a chicken egg to make the assumption it came from a chicken. Similarly, we've never seen design come from anything else but an intelligent mind. And so when we see design, I think it's very reasonable to assume or make the conclusion it has come from an intelligent mind. And then, of course, the difference between the three arguments is where we find design. Now, this is where kind of the argument runs into a bit of controversy. Maybe not controversy, maybe you could call it a difficulty. And the difficulty is, how do you detect design? How do we know if something is designed or not? That can be a tricky subject. I mean, sometimes it's black and white, right? Sometimes when you see something, it's obvious. You don't even have to put much thought into it. It's just clear that that has been designed. And then there's also black and white situations where you look at something and you say, well, no, that wasn't designed. That's just a natural happenstance, so to speak. But there are times where there are situations or things that are more in the middle, and you're wondering, has that been designed? Think of like an archaeologist digging through the dirt, looking for artifacts from an ancient civilization. And they discover things, and they dig up things out of the dirt, and they think, is this just a natural occurring piece of a rock or something? Or is this maybe something that was designed by an ancient civilization? Sometimes that's difficult to tell. So I want to give you guys a discussion question, and this is just for a few minutes. I'll let you guys discuss with the people around you. How do we detect design? Is it even possible? How do we do that? How do we detect design? If we can, how do we do it? And if not, why? So go ahead and just turn around or talk to the person next to you. I'll give you just a few minutes to discuss that question. Get your minds thinking this morning. Well, I think the example of archaeologists fits really well. There's other fields that run into this issue, but archaeologists are the classic example. I like to use the example of archaeologists in a particular movie. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's called The Dig. But The Dig is about a real-life discovery. It's based on a true story. In 1938, the Sutton Hoo excavation in England, where they discovered a buried ship that actually had a burial chamber in it from the 6th century. So really good movie. It's enjoyable and informative. And they found some amazing artifacts in this particular dig. Here's just one. Isn't that beautiful? But how do these archaeologists know when they're digging through the dirt? How do they know when they've discovered something that was designed by intelligent minds, i.e., prior civilizations? So, for example, they might be digging through the dirt and find something like this, and they might think, well, is this just a random piece of nature? Or is this some sort of designed bowl, let's say? Sometimes it's hard to tell. However, sometimes it's very obvious. So if they clean it off, let's say, and it looks like this, that's fairly obvious it's been designed. Now, this can't just go by feeling or intuition. There's actually been some mathematical structure, mathematical models that have been put together to help quantify and objectify how to detect design. We're not going to get into the mathematics of it, but let's discuss some of the tools or the thought processes that folks in this field, archaeology, and others use to try to detect design. The key piece of evidence of design is specified complexity. Maybe you've heard those terms before. Complexity, if something's complex, it just means that it has multiple parts. So this clicker that I'm using would be considered complex, right? Because there's a lot of electronic parts and plastic parts that make it up. So complexity means a lot of parts, but then it's also specified. There's a non-random arrangement of those parts. So like this clicker, again, because you can imagine this clicker, if you took all the parts, separated them and just threw them on the floor, it wouldn't work. But since they're put together in a very specified way such that it functions, that's the specificity. So specified complexity is what people are using for, or looking for, to try to see if something's been designed. And this can be measured mathematically. Again, we're not going to get into the statistics behind it, but this can be measured mathematically, this idea of something being specified and complex. And through that, a high degree of confidence can be achieved in knowing that something has been designed or not. One of the most stark examples of design is language. Think about it for a moment. If an archaeologist is digging through the dirt and they find something they can't quite tell if it's a random piece of nature or something that's been designed by a prior civilization, right? If it has language on it, that just screams design. Even if it's not a language that we can even read nowadays, an ancient dead language that we can't interpret. If we see that it has language, think about it. Language is a stark example of something that's complex. There's a lot of pieces to it, but it's also specified. It has to be laid out in a very specific arrangement for it to work. So language is one of those clear case examples of design. This is the basics of William Paley's famous watch example. I heard some of you talk about this during your discussion time. William Paley's famous example from the 1700s when he was making design arguments talked about finding a watch on the beach. And if you find a watch on the beach, you know immediately that it was designed by an intelligent mind. Why? Well, because it's complex, there's a lot of parts, and those parts are put together in a very specific way in order for it to function. So a watch is another classic example of specified complexity. You would have a very hard time trying to convince me that that wasn't designed by an intelligent mind. Now, interestingly enough, atheists, those who don't believe that there's a God, they recognize these elements of how to detect design. And I'll prove it to you. You might have seen this particular movie. It goes back to the 90s, goes back to quite a way when Matthew McConaughey was like practically a little kid. Jodie Foster. This is 1990s. This is the movie Contact. Now, Contact is very interesting because it's based on a novel written by Carl Sagan. And those of you from more mature generations will recognize the name Carl Sagan. He was a science professor at Harvard and Cornell, one of the most outspoken and famous agnostics from the 20th century. Now, in this particular movie, again, based on a book by Carl Sagan, it's interesting because the main character, Jodie Foster, works for SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Now, this is a real organization, and they're looking for intelligence out in space, and I don't fault them for that. It seems a reasonable thing to do. But in the movie, Jodie Foster works for that organization. They're looking for life out in space, and they're convinced, she becomes convinced that she discovers intelligence when she detects design out in space. So what is it within the movie, written by this agnostic, that causes her to think that she has detected design, that she has discovered intelligence out in space? Well, what she discovers within this fictional story, of course, is she discovers out in space a radio signal that's repeating all the prime numbers between 0 and 100. And when she detects that radio signal out in space, she doesn't even think twice about it. She knows that she's detected intelligence out in space. They don't explain it within the movie, but the background thought process is exactly what we're discussing this morning. There's specified complexity. And she's convinced then that there's intelligence out there in space. And she's right, by the way, within the context of the movie. Think about it. Even though this is a very simple message being communicated out in space, there's complexity, there's multiple parts, multiple numbers, but there's also specificity because there's a non-random arrangement of these parts, the prime numbers between 0 and 100. Well, now that we know how to detect design, let's move on in our first argument here, design in the universe. Now that we know how to detect design in anything, let's see if we can find design in the universe. Now, those of you here in Nebraska are very familiar with SAC, right? I give this lecture many places, but I like to tell people about something that we have here in Nebraska that's really special, and that is the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum between Lincoln and Omaha. And this is a really neat museum that has a lot of planes in it. That's probably what it's most well known for. But it also has some of these artifacts from the space race going back many decades. One of the things that I really enjoy looking at whenever I go to SAC is this Apollo Command Space Module from the 1960s. And one of the things that amazes me so much is all of the engineering that goes into building something like this that has to go into it to allow the astronauts to survive in space. I mean, just think of all the things that an astronaut needs to have to survive out in space. The oxygen has to be just right, the food, the water, breathing, all of that stuff, temperature, and all that engineering has to be packed into this small little command center, almost like a jail cell, so that they can survive. And it just amazes me, the engineering that goes into it, the, if you will, design, so that the life can exist. Similarly, it seems that the universe itself has been designed in a very specific way to create an environment or to be an environment in which life can exist. So almost as much, maybe if not more, design and engineering has gone into our universe to create an environment where life can exist. Similarly to all the design and engineering that goes into one of these space command centers that allows life, i.e. astronauts, to exist in space. Here's a quote from that scientist I use so often, Stephen Barr. He says, "What is coincidental is that certain characteristics of the laws of physics seem to coincide exactly with what is required for the universe to be able to produce and sustain life, including intelligent beings like ourselves." So what's really neat about our universe and what scientists have discovered, especially over the last 100 and 150 years, is all of these laws of physics, these constants, sometimes they're called, of the universe, that seem to be set just right so that life can exist within this universe. So you can almost imagine a control room, right? Imagine a control room, if you will, with a lot of dials in it. And it's almost as though our universe has such a control room where all the dials have been set to a very specific degree so that life could exist. And if any of the dials were just turned one little fraction of a hair to the left or to the right, our universe would not be able to sustain life. Now there's over 100 of these constants of the universe that have been discovered so far, these fine-tuned constants. And again, if any of them were slightly different, life wouldn't be able to exist at all. So I'll give you just a couple examples of these. One of them is the gravitational constant, okay? The gravitational constant of our universe. If it was different by this slight amount, then the sun could not exist, and the moon would crash into Earth or shear off into outer space. So the gravitational constant seems to be one of those things in our universe that was finely tuned or designed such that life could exist. Another one is the expansion rate of the universe. We talked a bit last week about the Big Bang, and it seems as though science has discovered that the universe began out of a point of singularity or out of a really nothingness. The universe came into existence out of nothing and was brought into existence through a process which scientists call the Big Bang. But there's an aspect, the expansion rate of the universe, when it came out of that singularity, it's been expanding ever since. That's one of the things that was detected in the early 1900s, which convinced scientists that the universe had a beginning, because if the universe is expanding, right, ultimately if you turn the clock backward, it comes back together to a singularity, universe coming from nothing, basically. But this expansion rate, the rate at which the universe expands, had to have been set just right. And this was a big discovery by scientist George Smoot in the 1990s. He actually won the Nobel Prize for this discovery. But one of the things he discovered is that this expansion rate had to be just perfect. Not too much, right? The expansion rate of the universe couldn't be too much, or matter could never congregate together into galaxies, stars, and planets. But it also couldn't be too little, or else the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. Right? So this expansion rate of the universe had to be set just right. This is one of the reasons why Stephen Hawking called this discovery the greatest scientific discovery of all time. Here's a quote from Stephen Hawking. You might recognize him, very well-known scientist from Oxford. Hawking wrote, "Why did the universe start out with so nearly the critical rate of expansion that separates models that recollapse from those that go on expanding forever? That even now, 10,000 million years later, it's still expanding at nearly the critical rate. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size. Now, these are just two examples of constants in our universe, physical constants, that seem to have been set just right so that life could thrive, could exist in our universe. And there's over 100 such fine-tuned constants that have led people to conclude that the universe shows signs of being designed. Here's a quote from a well-known astronomer, Arno Penzias. He was one of the co-discoverers of the radiation afterglow of the Big Bang, also won a Nobel Prize. But look at what he wrote. He said, "Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might even say, supernatural plan." Now, why does he say supernatural? Does he believe in ghosts and goblins? That's what we usually think of when we think of supernatural, right? No, all he means by that is that it seems like this design must have come from outside of nature. Because nature is what we're talking about that shows evidence of design. And if nature, i.e. nature just being space, time, and matter, that's what the universe is, space, time, and matter, that's nature. And if all that came from nothingness, the design or the cause of that must be outside of nature. That's all he means by supernatural. And I would agree. It seems to indicate that something before the universe, before nature, before space, time, and matter, designed it to exist the way that it does, the universe. What we have here is simply what we've been discussing, specified complexity. Complex, and there's multiple parts, right? Multiple constants. And then specificity, in that those constants have been set just right in a very specific way such that life could exist in our universe. Now let's move on. We were not going to spend, let me share this quote first. This fine-tuning argument for the existence of God is usually considered the strongest argument for God out there. Even atheists will say that. This is Christopher Hitchens. He's passed away now, but one of the most famous atheists over the last 20 or 30 years said this. He said, "At some point, certainly, we're all asked which is the best argument you come up against from the other side." He's talking about our side, theists. "I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing, that just 1 degree, 1 hair different, and nothing. No life, nothing. You have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not a trivial argument. We all say that." So it's very good to be familiar with this fine-tuning argument because, like I said, it is considered by many the most powerful, compelling argument for God. But now let's move on to the next design argument we want to look at this morning. We're not going to spend much time on it, maybe just a couple minutes, but it follows the same structure, as you can see, and it's specifically talking about our planet and all the things about our planet that make it seem as though it's been designed specifically for life. And it's quite amazing. Maybe you've done some studies like this and seen all the things that go into and are a part of our planet such that it can exist the way it is, that we can live on it so comfortably. So I'll just give you one example here. Again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this particular argument. But one example is that Earth is not so close to the sun that we burn up, but also not so far away that we freeze solid. It seems to be placed at a very specific point where these temperature ranges are livable. Earth is large enough to have sufficient gravity to retain an atmosphere, but not so large that it retains hydrogen gas, which would be the wrong kind of atmosphere, at least for us. Now, there was a day where people thought, well, this probably happens all over the place, right? There's so many planets out there in our universe. Earth isn't all that special. This probably happens a lot. However, scientists have discovered that, in fact, that's not the case. And Earth is very, very rare to have all of these things working together for it perfectly, which tends to point to design. Again, specified complexity. There's a lot of complex things going on with our planet to make it livable, right? So complex, and they're specified. It's put together in a very specific way for life to exist and, in fact, thrive. So this is another common design argument. The last one we want to look at, and again, there's many of these arguments, but the last one we want to look at this morning is the design of life, biological life. Now, as you can imagine, this particular argument isn't as popular, or I guess I could say compelling, to people today, mostly because of evolution, right? Mostly because of evolution, this argument doesn't have the same sort of force that the other ones do. But we're going to talk through that issue. However, even though it might not be as compelling, might not be as powerful as the other design arguments, I think it's still quite effective. In fact, this particular design argument was one of the major reasons that one of the most famous atheists from the 20th century, Antony Flew, changed his mind and became a theist, or you could say deist in his case, but came to the conclusion that there is in fact a supreme being. And it was in large part due to this particular design argument, the design of life. So it is still good to be familiar with it, and we'll walk through this design argument from life. So let's start out just thinking about the simplest form of life, right? A single-celled organism. Now, 100 years ago, scientists thought the cell was basically just a blob of protoplasm, right? They weren't very impressed by the cell. And so for them, these scientists 100 years ago or so, for them, it was very easy in their minds to think that, well, maybe many years ago, chemicals came together in some sort of primordial goop and just accidentally formed a cell. Because again, they didn't realize how complex the cell actually is. They thought it was just a blob of protoplasm. But over the last 100, 120 years, while telescopes have allowed us to understand our universe in that much more detail, our microscopes have been developed such that we can dig down into the cell and see how complex it really is. It's not a simple blob of protoplasm. The cell is actually a factory that is building other factories. So even a single-celled organism is highly complex. Now again, I'm not a scientist, so I have to lean on professional scientists for a lot of these details, but Stephen Barr, in that book, does a great job walking through the scientific discoveries which have strengthened this argument for the design of life. One of these scientific discoveries was the discovery of DNA. So in the 1950s, DNA was confirmed to contain genetic information. So bottom line, DNA includes encoded instructions for how to build all living things. It's a language. DNA is an entire language built on a 4-letter alphabet. Now you might say, well, that's not very sophisticated, 4-letter alphabet. I mean, we in English, we have a 26-letter alphabet. But consider, right, that computers and everything that computers can do is based on a 2-letter alphabet, zeros and ones. So a 4-letter language can accomplish quite a bit. And that's what DNA is. It's a 4-letter alphabet, a language built on a 4-letter alphabet. In fact, talking about computers, Bill Gates said that DNA is the most efficient language and storage device in the universe. I'll give you just an example of some neat research that's being done by somebody within our own church. You guys might be familiar with Joel Moorman. He's working on his master's degree at UNL in electrical engineering. But what he's studying in his master's thesis is DNA. And you might think, well, what is an electrical engineer doing studying DNA? Well, it's because the trick in electrical engineering right now, what all they're focusing on for the most part, is how to package as much information as possible in as small of a package as possible. So we can stream more movies and music and data, right? So the internet, we want to stream information as much as possible. So it's trying to pack information in as small a package as possible so we can stream more data, right? That's what electrical engineers are working on a lot these days. But they recognize that DNA is the most efficient packaging of information that we've ever discovered. And so Joel, in his master's degree research at UNL, is studying DNA to try to understand how to package information more effectively. And if you ever get a chance to watch his lecture or hear his lecture, which we have on the website, it's pretty amazing, the research that he's doing at UNL. It has a lot of intelligent design implications in his research of DNA. It's very fascinating stuff. So DNA as a language is a very striking example, as we've discussed. Language is a very stark example of design because there's specified complexity to it. So think about just that single-celled organism again. How much information is written in the DNA of a simple single-celled organism? Take a look at this quote from Stephen Barr again. He wrote, "Even a bacterium, single-celled organism, the simplest kind of living thing, has, according to molecular biologists, an enormously complicated structure. By some reckonings, it would take as great a quantity of information as there is in the Encyclopedia Britannica to describe all the parts of a bacterium and how they are put together." That's how much information is packed into the DNA of the simplest form of life, a single-celled organism. Now, those of you in the younger generation, encyclopedias were these books where if you wanted to learn something, they were categorized alphabetically. You had to go look it up in an actual paper book. But we're talking like took a shelf this big, A through Z. So language, specified complexity. That's why some people argue that DNA is actually one of the strongest evidences of design. Here's a quote from another scientist, Stephen Meyer, who got his PhD from Cambridge University. Dr. Meyer wrote, "Our uniform experience affirms that specified information, whether inscribed hieroglyphics, language, ancient language, written in a book, encoded in a radio signal, like that movie Contact, or produced in a simulation experiment, always arises from an intelligent source. We've just never seen language or information or design come from anything but a mind and not a strictly material process." This is just an empirical observation. We've just never seen information, language, design come from any other source but an intelligent mind, a designer, if you will. That's why I think this conclusion is very reasonable, that the universe, that earth, and that biological life itself has a designer. You might notice, just like last week, that the argument, the conclusion of it, technically point 3, doesn't end with God, just ends with a designer. But this is where, in the discussion, we use a process called abductive reasoning. Now, I didn't have time to cover and explain abductive reasoning last week, so I'll take just a couple minutes to do that this morning. You're probably familiar with other forms of reasoning. They're more well known. There's deductive reasoning. You can think of almost like a proof or a mathematical proof, premise, conclusion, following logic. That's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is what the scientific method is based on. It's based on observations. So inductive reasoning works as follows. You go around and you look at as many swans as you possibly can find, and you see that all the swans that you've discovered are white, and based on that empirical observation, that inductive reasoning, you conclude then that all swans are white. Now, there might be a purple swan somewhere on Earth that you haven't discovered yet. That's a possibility, but it's very reasonable to conclude that all swans are white based on your empirical observations that you've never seen anything but a white swan. That's inductive reasoning. That's what our scientific method is based on. Abductive reasoning is a little bit different. Abductive reasoning works as follows. Abductive reasoning is more about trying to discover what is the best explanation for something. It can use deductive reasoning, it can use inductive reasoning, but it's kind of a separate process because you're looking for the best fit. You're looking for what's most plausible, what's most reasonable. And so abductive reasoning is something we use all the time. I think last week I used the example of hearing a knock on a door, right? Now there's all sorts of possibilities of what could cause that knock, right? There might be aliens that have come from another planet who caused that knock. It might be a random echo from some other activity that's taking place in the room, right? There might be a giraffe on the other side of the room knocking on the door. You can think of an infinite amount of possibilities of what caused that knock, but based on experience, based on good causal fit, what's the most likely explanation? Well, it's that there's a human being, one of our friends is on the other side of that door knocking. And that would even, our certainty about that would increase if we got, let's say, a text message saying that, yeah, it's Mike and he's trying to get through, but the door's locked. So it's that sort of abductive reasoning that can lead us to certain conclusions. And we use abductive reasoning all the time. One of the examples that I use of abductive reasoning is finding a cabin in the woods. If you were walking through the woods, walking through a forest, and you came across a log cabin, you could reasonably assume that it was built by an intelligent mind. Some prior human being was there that built that cabin. Are there other possibilities? Of course. You could use the example too of, let's say, going to Mars. And there's always, every once in a while you hear something in the news where we've discovered design on Mars, right? You see these pictures and people are convinced that there was some prior civilization or intelligent minds on Mars because they see something that looks like it's been designed and then it's, shown that it wasn't, right? But it's the same thing. If we see something like that has specified complexity, whether it's on Mars or walking through a forest, we reasonably conclude that it was built or designed by an intelligent mind. That's the process of abductive reasoning. Are there other explanations for how there could be a cabin in the woods? Well, yeah, but we've just never seen a cabin come together in any other way. We're not saying it's impossible, right? One silly example is that the trees just happened to fall exactly right so that they formed a cabin, a log cabin. Is that possible? I suppose. But nobody deals in terms of those possibilities, right? That is such a minute possibility. We immediately recognize that it's been designed, conclude that it's been designed. If you want to delve down further into that example, I wrote an article a few years ago called A Cabin. A former statistician, that was my prior life. I was an actuary, but nobody knows what that is, so I said statistician. A former statistician responds to a critique of the Bayesian fine-tuning argument for God. A little bit more technical. It does delve into the mathematics, but if you're into that sort of thing, you can take a look on the website. It was published in Liberty's academic journal. So when we find design in the universe, in Earth, or in life, it's very reasonable, I think, using abductive reasoning to conclude it was built by some sort of intelligent mind. Again, we've just never seen design come from any other source but an intelligent mind. A couple quotes here as we wrap things up. We're doing right at about 10 o'clock. Here's another quote from Stephen Barr, pointing to the symmetry. found here in the universe. He wrote, "If symmetry is found in works of art of every sort, and is an important element in what it is to be beautiful, and if as well the laws of nature are based on symmetries that are so sophisticated and so deep," he's talking as a physics professor here, the mathematics behind the universe, "that while we may study them with the tools of modern mathematics, they lie far above our mental powers to appreciate on an intuitive level. Does that not suggest the mind of an artist at work that is far above the level of our own minds?" I mean, we're still making mathematical discoveries that just blow our minds, how beautiful mathematics has been put together, and that our universe is based on those mathematics. I think this quote was in the video, but this is from Fred Hoyle, professor of astronomy at Cambridge University. He wrote, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seems to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." So we can continue to add to our list. We started this list last week from the first cause argument. And I think using abductive reasoning, we can start to make some of these conclusions about what this supreme being or uncaused cause is like. From the first cause argument last week, we reasonably concluded that this first cause, this ultimate supreme being, is supernatural, just means beyond nature, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, because all those things, space, time, and matter, came to exist when the universe came to exist. That's just what the universe is. So you would think the first cause had to be beyond those things, or before those things, if you will. I think it's reasonable to conclude this first cause, this supreme being, is incredibly powerful to create the universe out of nothing, and then by default would be considered a creator or designer. And from the design argument now this week, I think we can conclude that this first cause, this supreme being, has some sort of an intelligent mind, akin to ours, let's say. And this is how most theists understand God to be, having these characteristics. And so that's why I keep saying that there are thinkers throughout history, all around the world, who came to this same conclusion. The vast majority of thinkers throughout history have been theists. Some might categorize some of them as polytheists, but still within every polytheistic system, there is an ultimate being. So even within polytheism, there's always going to be a supreme being from which all the other beings come. So the vast majority of thinkers around the world and throughout history have been theists of some sort, coming to this conclusion that there must be some sort of first cause, some sort of creator that created everything else. And as we've been seeing, it's because of these thought processes that they all share in common, which we're calling now arguments for God, but they're really just thought processes as thinkers from around the world throughout history have observed the world around them and thought through where this must have come from. The vast majority have concluded that there must be some sort of supreme being. And then they come to very similar understandings of what this God is like, having these particular characteristics. Now, the last thing we'll do this morning, we only have about 10 minutes left, is I want to go through some of the objections to this argument, particularly the fine-tuning argument. Since it's the most powerful, considered the most compelling argument for the existence of God, we want to talk about how our opponents, atheists, respond to it. Okay? Now, the main objection to the fine-tuning argument is chance, as the video discussed. So, for example, sometimes you'll hear things as follows. You'll say, well, look, if there was an infinite amount of time, then certainly anything that could possibly happen would eventually happen, including the emergence of life. A second objection works as follows. Well, if there were an infinite amount of planets, going back to the Earth showing signs of being designed just right for life, They would say, well, if there's just an infinite amount of planets out there in our universe, then certainly at least one of them would be balanced just right for life. That could explain why Earth is so special. Or the last one, and this one kind of implies the multiverse, which Hollywood has really picked up on the last few years, and all of our stories are about the multiverse these days. But the idea, the pushback against the fine-tuning argument about the infinite amount of universes goes like this. Well, if there were an infinite amount of universes out there, then certainly at least one of them would be structured just right for life. Now, the first objection you don't hear hardly at all anymore. And why is that? Well, it's because science has shown that the universe had a beginning, that time itself had a beginning. And so we can't really talk about infinite time anymore, because all scientists recognize that time had a beginning at the beginning of the universe. But you still do hear the other two. And I'm going to let you guys discuss, even though we're getting close to the end. I want to give you guys a discussion question. How would you respond to this objection to the fine-tuning argument, to the design of the universe? So I'll give you just a couple minutes to discuss with yourselves about how you would respond to that objection. Get your mind going here. All right, well, this objection is often referred to as the multiverse objection. So it's familiar. It's important to think through it and to have a response ready to go. Because as I said, Hollywood has really picked up on this idea of a multiverse. And so the average layperson is very familiar with the idea. You know, all of our the Marvel universe has gone this direction. I mean, there's just the big movie last year, was it Everything Everywhere All at Once, was based on this multiverse that won all the Oscars last year. I mean, this idea of a multiverse has saturated our culture. And so it's good to be familiar with the objection and how we would respond to it. Is there a multiverse? Is there any evidence of a multiverse? First of all, we can say this. It's really impossible to empirically verify if there are an infinite amount of planets or universes, because they would be unobservable to us, right? Now, there are mathematical models that people point to and claim that they indicate there is such a thing as a multiverse, but that is very speculative. Empirically observing it would be impossible. Another thing we can push back on about this multiverse objection is to point out that it is a deus ex machina. In other words, it's a God out of the box, right? A God out of the machine. It's just too powerful of an argument. This is the point that I made in my debate with Dan Barker. I debated an atheist about the existence of God, Dan Barker, at an atheist conference down in Florida a couple years ago. And we're turning that into a book. You can watch the debate. It's on our YouTube channel. But in that debate, he brought up the multiverse objection several times. But one of the ways that I pushed back against it was to point out that it is too powerful of an argument, because it would dismiss anything that we could possibly point to that might indicate design. The archaeologist, the person walking through the woods. For example, right, if somebody who wasn't aware of our country's history and knew about Mount Rushmore, right, if they came upon that mountain with the faces carved into the side of it, Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, and one of them was arguing that that was evidence of design, a multiverse objection could go as follows. Well, if there's an infinite amount of universes, then certainly in one universe, that would just happen by accident, right? And then the other person would say, well, no, that certainly was designed by an intelligent mind. So you see that the multiverse argument accomplishes too much. It proves too much. It destroys any sort of argument for design, not only for the universe, but anything. A cabin in the woods, Mount Rushmore, etc. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that there wouldn't be any possibility for us to detect design if the multiverse objection is used. It would be impossible for us to detect design in any way, in any scenario, whether it was an archaeologist or walking through the woods, seeing a watch. You could use the same explanation for finding a watch on the beach. You could say, well, no, we can't know that that's from an intelligent mind, this watch, because if there is an infinite amount of universes, then certainly in one of those universes, that would just happen naturally. You see, it accomplishes too much. And so I think that's another way to push back against this multiverse objection. It also results in quite crazy absurdities. And this would be like an reductio ad absurdum argument, showing how your opponent's position leads to absurdities. This comes from Stephen Barr. Because if you think about it, if there are an infinite amount of universes, then anything that could possibly happen has happened in one of those universes. So then you have situations as follows, where the Wizard of Oz actually took place, or that Kermit the Frog is a living being who's the President of the United States. It results in absurdities. It's comical to point those things out, but it's important to show that this multiverse idea just does not work. It does seem quite interesting, though. We'll close with this. But if you think about it for a moment, it seems very, very interesting that opponents to theism, right, atheists, are willing to accept the idea of an infinite amount of planets or an infinite amount of universes, but they're not willing to accept the idea or even consider the idea of an infinite being. So in other words, to avoid an infinite being, instead they propose either infinite time, infinite planets, or infinite universes. But I like how the video said, even if the multiverse is true, and I don't think there's any evidence that there is, it would still need some sort of first cause. You can't point to that as being the ultimate being, because that itself seems to be something that needs to be fine-tuned and caused. So we'll close with this. This is one last quote from Stephen Barr, making the point that I just explained. Stephen Barr wrote that, in order to explain the origin of life from inanimate matter in a way that doesn't invoke divine intervention, it may be necessary to postulate an unobservable infinite amount of planets or universes. How ironic that, having renounced belief in God because God is not material or observable by any sense or instrument, the atheist may be driven to postulate not one, but an infinite amount of unobservables in the material world itself. It seems that to abolish one unobservable God, it takes an infinite number of unobservable substitutes. All right, well, I'm looking forward to next week. Next week, we're going to tackle the moral argument for God, and that's the one that I actually specialize in. So very much looking forward to that. Thanks for coming this morning.